Welcome to Minds Between Languages. It is our pleasure to introduce Kristian Tangsgaard Hvelplund, who will tell us about the use of eye tracking to explore cognitive aspects of translation. Kristian, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this new episode of Minds Between Languages. It is a treat to have you here.
Thank you, Adolfo. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for doing this important interview sessions, and I'm very glad to be part of it.
Fantastic. So let's get down to business here. And a good deal of your work is focused on eye tracking. Could you tell us a little bit about what this technique is all about?
Yeah. So essentially, eye tracking, it's a technique that is used to measure or capture the location of the eye. For instance, on the computer screen relative to the content on that computer screen. So it's a way to measure eye movement activity and look at reading from a sort of experimental perspective. For the kind of work that we do in translation process research, we often use screen-based eye trackers. It's the most standard kind of system in TPR. And essentially what an eye tracker does is that it has a set of diodes located in the frame, for instance, of the screen, which emits it emits infrared light that is reflected on the eye's cornea, on the eye's retina, and then it bounces back and is captured by a camera that is built into the frame of the eye tracker typically. So it does so with fairly high accuracy and precision, although it's only accurate down to about 0.5 centimeters, which means that we usually use larger fonts for our designs, for our texts, double line spacing, and of course this has some implications in terms of ecological validity, because it doesn't mimic or imitate completely the setup that a translator would usually be comfortable with, but we do get some good data about the eye movements that occur during translation.
But at the same time, in terms of ecological validity, I mean, it's a very nice setup, right? I mean, the participant just goes to your lab, he or she sits facing a computer that is pretty much a regular laptop with a few tricks here and there, and they just sit and they translate away, or they type or copy a text. Would that be a fair way of describing the setup of a night tracking experiment?
Yeah. So at the University of Copenhagen, where I'm based, we have an eye tracking lab, a small eye tracking lab, where the participant is invited to come in. We take good care of our participants in the sense that we want to have the translator working as comfortably as possible in an as authentic as possible situation, which is a challenge sometimes. But the participant would come in, sit in a chair, sit about 60-70 centimeters from the eye tracker, and then we would have arranged a source text window and a target text window on the monitor that the participant would work from. So yeah, it's a fairly good description you made. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so now here's where the magic happens, because somehow you rely on these ocular movements to make inferences about cognitive processes. So how do we go from seeing and analyzing how eyes move to being able to say something about a mental process that is underlying the translation task?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a very good question, and it's a question that has interested researchers and doctors for at least 150 years, since the 1870s at least, where people were first kind of interested in the specific patterns that emerge when you read. You could sort of see the eyes would move and stop depending on the word, and it would stop for longer if it was a specific kind of word, and then it would jump to the next word. So people have been interested in these kinds of eye movements called fixations, where the eye is relatively still, and saccades, where the eye moves between fixations. And sort of fast forwarding to 1980, around 1980, some very influential psychologists, Just and Carpenter, formulated the I-mind assumption, which posits that the eye remains fixated on a word for as long or as short as it is being processed. So based on this assumption, we have sort of formulated a relationship between the visual focus and the cognitive focus, which is quite helpful in our research. And of course, this assumption has its problems because there might be cases where you would read a text and your mind would become completely disengaged with what you're reading, and you would think about what's for dinner. So, but you would generally see that kind of relationship between the visual attention and then the cognitive focus in translation.
Right, right. So, with so many tools that we have at our disposal nowadays to explore cognitive processes during translation, ranging from think aloud protocols to behavioral tasks to key logging approaches, even neuroscientific methods. I mean, what are the advantages? And then what are the drawbacks of eye tracking?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we often have to label, I think, in our research, because there are some pluses with using the eye tracking method, but there are definitely also some drawbacks. In terms of the advantages, the main advantages for me, as I see it, is that there are at least two. There is one which has to do with the intrusiveness. When you work with an eye tracker, although our participant would sit in a lab and they would be maybe at the beginning slightly uncomfortable with the observational methods that is eye tracking, they would forget it during the course of the translation task. That's not something that would happen, for instance, with a think aloud protocol, where the participant would have to verbalize the sort of the problem-solving activities online during the translation process. We don't have that problem specifically for eye tracking. Also, another advantage is that it's quite rich in terms of information. There's a high level of completeness in the sense that as long as a person is looking at the textual content, source text or target text, or digital aids, or looking at the screen, then we would have some kind of information available about the object of attention. So if we look at the eye-mind assumption, we could make a quite straightforward relationship between what is being looked at and what is being processed without asking that individual about what he or she is doing. So those are the sort of two main advantages. In terms of the problems or the limitations with eye tracking methods, well, there are a lot, of course. Aside from sort of the practical issues with getting an eye tracker, learning how to do eye tracking research and so on, there are some inherent problems with the eye tracking methods. One of them, as I mentioned, is the drift or the disengagement of cognitive focus from visual focus. So that is probably the main obstacle, the main problem that's, or one, I would mention another one in a bit, but the problem arises when we look at something and then our mind drifts and we do we think about something unrelated to a specific task. So for translation specifically, the problem of drift isn't a great one, in the sense that when you do translation, you want to stay focused on that task because you want to finish your goal of translating. So we can also see it from the sort of the predictability of the reading patterns in translation, that there is, for the vast majority of time, there is an engagement with the translation task when we do translation. But there will obviously be moments during that process or that translation task where people would think it's something completely unrelated, and we wouldn't know anything about that. We wouldn't know when it happened and when it didn't happen.
Right.
But we can assume for the vast majority of time that is the case.
Right. So, well, as every single tool that we have at our disposal, there are pros and cons. But with this particular tool, you have explored a number of very interesting topics in your career so far. I'm interested in a few of them, Kristian. So one of the things that you've researched is this notion of processing flow, right? So could you tell us what that is in particular, and then how it can be tracked or examined using eye tracking?
Sure. Yeah. So processing flow is actually something that I look at with a kind of a combination of data. So I actually use both eye tracking data and key logging data to have some kind of a richer set of data, or a even higher level of completeness about what is going on when a person is translating. Essentially, the idea with processing flow is that that we can use the eye tracking and key logging data to investigate the sequence of translation production. For instance, during regular translation, we would find that there is a sequence going from source text to target text processing in a straightforward manner. And then sometimes you would also look at a digital, use digital aids, or go to Google. But if we look at the polysemiotic translation, for instance, dubbing translation, translation of dubbing manuscripts, or subtitling, you have a number of other areas or potential areas of interest that could attract your attention. So for dubbing translation, which I was investigating in a study, there were at least a source text manuscript, a target text manuscript. There were time codes. There was the audiovisual content in terms of a video clip running, and then there was the typing activity as a non-eye tracking based area of interest, and then there was a dictionary. So there were a lot of competing areas of interest that would take up the translator's sort of cognitive focus. And what was interesting with the processing flow was that you could sort of investigate the successive line of processing that would go from looking at the source text manuscript, jumping down to the audiovisual material, looking at the target text manuscript, typing something, so going down to a non-eye tracking area of interest, going back to the target text manuscript to verify that your output was correct, then look at time codes, because that's also an important part of audiovisual translation, and then you would go back to the target text manuscript. So using processing flow, you can sort of investigate the path of or the sequence of processing during a translation task.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so it's an interesting way of looking at translation in a sort of sequential manner.
Right, and capturing the dynamicity of translation, right, which sometimes escapes other approaches. And you mentioned attention, right, and that's one of another of the main topics that you have worked on. And I guess it's hard to disentangle attention from any other construct that you are focusing on, especially with eye tracking. But you did mention that, in an eye tracking experiment, you do replicate this division of the workspace, right? With source text on the top, and then the target text or the window of the target text on the bottom. And you can see how the eye is traveling, right, back and forth between source and target text. So how do we allocate attention between the source and the target text? Is attention mainly devoted to one of them? Does it change dynamically based on different factors?
Yeah, you point to sort of the traditional setup of most translators that work with the source text target text setup, and this is also the inspiration for many designs to sort of look at source text and target text separately. It's something I've done in many of my studies, looking at how much attention goes into source text processing compared with target text processing. I should mention maybe briefly that attention and cognitive resources are related, but probably not synonymous, in the sense that attention is sort of the engagement, the active, the conscious engagement of cognitive resources to solve a specific problem, whereas cognitive resources, you could spend cognitive resources on a problem in an automated way without directing your attentional focus specifically to that task. But coming back to your question about the split or the difference between source text and target text processing, eye tracking data suggests that we spend more time looking at the target text. It suggests that we see consistently larger pupils, longer fixations during target text processing, which could indicate that something more is going on during that kind of processing. So it's maybe more information processing heavy than source text processing. But it's two very different tasks. So it's also a bit of an issue to compare apples and oranges, perhaps. One thing that I have been quite interested in is, what do we do when we read a source text and what do we do when we read a target text? And it's actually not as straightforward to separate them as it is in the manifestations of the data. So what actually happens when we read a source text is that we would formulate meaning hypothesis of a source text or a translation unit. We might want to consider how to solve that problem. And we might even go on to target text processing while we are actually manifesting source text fixations or source text eye movements. So it becomes a bit of an issue to consider them as separate as the data would suggest. It is probably more likely that there is source text processing going on during source text reading, but also some kind of reformulation kicks in already when we read a source text. There is evidence also in other studies that that is actually the case. But we can, at a more coarse level, we can see that the target text does attract more attention. It is the text during translation where we focus most of our time. And we do it for numerous reasons. There are different types of reading that occurs during target text reading, but the split is there, and it's probably not as straightforward to look at it as separate processing types.
I imagine, and that takes me right to my next question, which is about the different ways of reading that we are capable of, and because it will be perhaps intuitive but simplistic to say that, okay, now when you are translating, you're reading the source text and you're reading the target text and you go back and forth, but treating reading as if it were a unitary, a monolithic process. On the contrary, Kristian, you have identified different types of reading, right? At least 4.
Right.
So could you tell us a little bit about at least some of them, what differentiates each of them, and how you can capture those different patterns or those different ways of reading using eye tracking?
Sure. Yeah. It's a great question, and the inspiration for that study actually came from another study that I did with Arndt Løkke Jacobsen some 10, 12 years ago, where we were interested in looking at translation as a specific type of reading that was different from other types of reading. So reading for comprehension, reading for sight translation, and so on. And in that study 12 years ago, we could see some distinct differences in the way that you would read a text to be translated. And coming back to the types of reading in translation, where I sort of took an in-depth look at the specific types of reading that take place when you read for translation, I looked at 4 specific types of reading. One of them was source text reading, the prototypical idea of reading for translation, where you would read for comprehension with an aim to translate it, with a view to translation. The other one was reading the source text and typing a target text item simultaneously, or more or less at the same time. And then there were 2 kinds of target text reading of existing material and target text reading of emerging material on the monitor. And each of these different types of reading have specific goals, aimed purposes for the translator. When you read a source text item, you would read with a view to translate it. When you read something and you type a target text unit at the same time, you're probably not engaged in simultaneous awareness of 2 units. So the thing at stake here is probably that you're reading a source text item and then you are finalizing the production of a just finished translation unit that came before that one. That's at least one suggestion. And then target text reading of existing material, that would be a verification that you're content with what you're writing. You're checking spelling, you're checking commas, you're sort of checking the accuracy and the idiomaticity and verifying meaning hypothesis, essentially. When you read emerging texts, you are sort of monitoring your translation output online, you're checking the accuracy, you're monitoring for spelling and so on. And that kind of reading is actually the kind of reading where you would find the longest fixations, the largest pupils. So assuming the eye-mind assumption holds, then that will be the kind of reading where you are actually engaged most cognitively in the translation production, compared to source text reading, where fixations are shorter. Also, the other types of reading fixations are also shorter. But this kind of reading is where you would find the longest fixations. And this actually challenges a bit the eye-mind assumption, because although we do find very large fixations or long fixations and large pupils here, it could have to do with the fact that the eye is actually not engaged in processing activity, but it's just waiting for the typing activity to finish, right? So you're just monitoring something, and people tend to write more slowly than they actually read. So it could be a kind of a mechanical effect rather than a cognitive effect.
Very nice point. Yeah, fantastic. No, that's a great point. Yes, and it's also interesting to see how the study of translation itself may actually inform a wider framework of research. Extending beyond translation itself and with wide implications for language processing and psychology at large. Now, but going back to translation itself, anybody who's ever attempted to translate a text, it doesn't matter if you're a professional or a student, or even someone with no formal training or experience, you probably get the feeling that there are certain passages, certain parts of a text that are more challenging than others. Sometimes you can work out the translation of a unit in just a spur of a second, and sometimes you're there, and you have to think about it, and you can think about possible alternatives, and you're always questioning the result. So having spent so much time looking at how eyes are traversing source and target texts, Kristian, have you been able to identify certain textual features, certain types of words or segments or phrases or clauses that may be more taxing, more cognitively demanding than others?
Yeah, really good question, and something that I would want to keep exploring with other text types. I've been looking mainly at literature and LSP texts, so language for specialized purposes, and the items that sort of grab the attention and keeps the attention grabbed is, for instance, low frequent items, so a source text item that is unfamiliar to the translator. Culture specific items is also something, because you would want to translate a source, a cultural item from let's say, for instance, the Danish fastelavn, which doesn't have an equivalent in an American or a non-Danish context. So how would you translate that specific thing? So these cultural items would also grab attention and keep the focus attracted to that item. Imagery, metaphoricity, idioms would also grab attention. And then one thing that I would love to look at, because I've been giving my students Shakespeare translations, I would be very interested to see how they actually work with that kind of text, because there are certainly some difficulties with that kind of text, imposing a lot of additional effort, restraints, and so on. So, but you would find source text problem or items that could increase attention or increase the time, and also for the target text, you might find an item that has several possible translations. So you want to browse through your mental lexicon to find the right equivalent. And most recently, in a study I did with Caroline Lehr, we looked at emotional content and how emotional content actually influences the overall fixations and pupil sizes during translation. So there is actually an effect of emotion also on the way that you would read a text,
right,
for translation.
And sometimes when we think about translation, there's still this romantic figure of Saint Jerome working by candlelight, right? But that's really miles away from the reality of actual translation nowadays. And if anything, translation is now pretty much dependent on digital resources, many of them.
Yeah.
And so in your studies, have you been able to ascertain some of the ways in which digital resources impact on our on cognition during translation, maybe on the allocation of attentional resources and so on?
Yeah. So it's a very interesting topic, the one that has to do with the translator's use of digital aids in the translation process. It's something which hasn't grabbed the attention of researchers, to stay in the metaphor, very much, unfortunately, because in some of my research, I found that the use of digital aids during the process actually accounts for up to a quarter of the entire translation process. So this, of course, merits some research attention because if as much as 25% of the entire translation process doesn't have to do with source text processing or target text typing, but has to do with the use of external aids, then we also want to see how that is integrated into the overall translation process. Also, from a more pedagogical or didactical perspective, we would want to be interested in the digital aids perspective, because it could hopefully be formulated into something that could be useful in our teaching. So I think that the prospects or the possibilities of looking much more into the use of digital aids in translation has some very positive applications, which I think we need to look more into. Yeah.
Fantastic. So one final question, Kristian. I mean, you've spent so many, by now, hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades, looking at eyes and trying to see how they can inform about underlying cognitive processes. So with all this experience, are you now able to go to a supermarket or a bank or the university and look at someone in the eye and just get a grasp of what they're thinking?
Yeah, I wish. Wouldn't that be something? No, not really. Maybe all of this work has made me even more confused in many aspects of life. I don't know, but it has definitely opened up some interesting questions, especially in terms of research. It's once you look at a set of data, then you kind of you get the answer for 2 or 3 of your questions, and then it opens up for 10 more questions. So I think this, as there is a data explosion with all the eye tracking data, there's also an explosion of new questions and hypotheses that kind of emerge out of all this data. So there's a lot of prospects and applications, but also a lot of questions and even more questions than before. And unfortunately, I probably wouldn't be able to detect someone's processing activity without an eye tracker, actually.
I feel much safer now, I have to say, after half an hour of your eyes looking directly into mine. That's reassuring. So thank you very much, Kristian. This was very informative. Thanks a lot for joining this initiative, and we certainly look forward to learning more about the new answers that you will come up in future years for the new questions that your previous research has already prompted. So thank you once again, and we'll be looking forward to learning and reading more from you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.